All right, everyone. It's 5 o'clock. Let's get things started. My name is Chandler Williams. I am the co-president here for the Colorado State chapter of Students SCASLA, and we're here to present our first presentation for the LA Days lecture series. Tonight, our first guest, we welcome Diana Fernandez, Bibeau, and she has a really awesome presentation to kick things off with. I'm very excited to share it with everybody, and she has some really awesome things to say. I would like to thank our sponsors, Colorado, Wyoming, ASLA, ASCSU, the Department of Horticulture and Landscape Architecture here at CSU, and then also our club for putting this event on. I'll pass it on to Catherine Kaiser to introduce our first guest, Diana.
Well, can you see me? Okay. Hello, everyone. Oh, no. Wait, can you hear me? Okay, sorry about that, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Chandler. My name is Catherine Kaiser, a third year in landscape architecture program at CSU. Tonight, we have the pleasure of listening to Diana Fernandez Bibeau. If you have any questions at any point in the lecture, please pose them in the Q&A section of the chat. So tonight we'll be listening to Diana, and Diana is a proven thinker, collaborator, and leader who teams effortlessly with architects, planners, urban designers, ecologists, and civil engineers on the design of equitable and sustainable places. Her experience spans a broad range of projects from planning to built work. Diana provides critical thought and design leadership for our landscape and planning practices in urban studio. She brings to each project, as well as a myriad corporate initiative, strong critical thinking, a willingness to engage in thoughtful debate, and a commitment to quality. She leads and champions better equity and inclusion in our planning and built space design practices from a landscape perspective. Prior to joining SASAKI, Diana worked as a landscape architect and project designer in Philadelphia, where she worked on urban and campus projects in the metro area. She writes and lectures in the discourses of landscape architecture and urban design and equity. Without further ado, I present Diana Fernandez Bibeau.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for that introduction. Super excited to be hosted today by you all here. Thank you to the organizing team for getting this all worked out. And I hope that the presentation today gives us a little bit of hope. I know there's a lot going on in the world today, and sort of shed some light into how I'm leading my practice at SASAKI and how I'm navigating the landscape architecture profession. So I also want to say, like, feel free to always add questions to the Q&A. I love kind of thoughtful engagement, so feel free to kind of pop those in. And then I'm really looking forward to sort of the Q&A afterwards. So as I dial in, I wanted to first kind of give you guys a little bit of an update into who we are at SASAKI. We're an interdisciplinary practice that's really focused on proving human potential, basically making the world a better place. And what's really fun about our firm is that it's not just landscape architects, even though our founder, Hideo Sasaki, founded the firm around landscape architecture and this sort of, at the time, in the 50s, this very nouveau way of practicing where you brought all these different thinkers to the table. And it's really fortified our practice to be what it is today. We're, I think, closer to like 350 people these days. And it's a bunch of really fun folks, everyone from, architects to interior designers to software engineers and data analysts that really add a great deal to our work and really enforce the way in which, we sort of add value to our clients and communities we work in. Now, one of the things that's like really exciting also about our practice at SASAKI is that it's really about embracing what makes us really unique. And, you know, we have offices in Boston, in Denver, as well as in Shanghai. And we have folks, you know, hailing from like 30 different countries and speaking over 45 different languages. And it really does help to sort of make up a really robust office that's just always full of energy and great ideas. And I always say that one of my favorite things about working at SASAKI are just the people. It's really incredible to go to work every day and just be blown away with the intelligence, the kindness of these people, and just their, you know, talents that really do make our work possible. Given that, you know, we hail from all of these places and that we have all these different practice or disciplines within the firm, it really allows us to think about design excellence under this very broad lens. So we've been recognized as a firm for, you know, with over 750 awards, and this ranges from planning and urban design work that we do all the way to landscape architecture and interior design. And really what this speaks to is this notion of being able to think about SASAKI as being able to meet design excellence at all of these tiers, and that, you know, when we look at some of these architecture and interior projects or even planning, all of them are influenced by landscape architecture, as well as our architecture practice is influenced by planning and urban design and architecture. So it really does lead to a really robust process that's sort of built on collaboration and always geared towards design excellence. Another thing that's also really important for us at SASAKI is being able to create space and think about our practice in new ways, and in terms of how we give back to the community and how we provide design services to folks that may not necessarily have the fees to pay for them. And this, you know, led to the formation of the SASAKI Foundation, which is our nonprofit arm. And helps to operate as sort of this connection between the outside community, our research capacity inside, and also this idea of sort of incubating new ideas into communities, you know, across the Boston, Denver, and Shanghai area, but also more globally. And one of the things that I really love about the fact that, you know, I work at SASAKI is that Hideo really set us up for success. There's always this like quote we share at SASAKI where like contribution is the only value. And this is something that Hideo used to say often. And it's really about being able to bring all of these incredible minds together to solve some really difficult, you know, problems and issues. This image you see here, a bunch of my colleagues who were working on, a framework plan for the city of Kabul in Afghanistan. And, you know, it's real people, it's real commitment to this idea of candor and being able to solve problems, really leveraging all of our different perspectives as we come to the table. And, you know, one of the fun things too is that like you look at this image and you don't know who the principal is, right? There's not one person that's like the big fat pen, you know. It's about all of us being able to sort of come together and share ideas as we can contribute within the design table. Another fun thing about us at SASAKI too is that there's a lot that we do centered around data. We're just nerds at our heart, and it's really exciting for me to talk about our SASAKI strategies team. These are folks that are computer programmers or software engineers or data analysts that help us build custom tools for our clients. And, you know, taking data and being able to visualize it in really exciting ways, all the way to, you know, creating apps that help to visualize some of the design ideas that we're trying to relate to communities. And I think this really does set us apart as sort of this rigor around being able to work with these really brilliant programmers and marry that with urban design and landscape architecture in a way that really informs our design to be heavily data-driven and analytical in nature. So this is kind of, you know, I want to kind of transition a little bit because I think this is a lot about SASAKI. And I want to give you a little bit of insight into, you know, how I kind of got into the profession and particularly how this is sort of reinforced with some of the research that really does define my practice. So, you know, I've been working with the Landscape Architecture Foundation over the last several years to develop heterogeneous futures as a paradigm for landscape architecture practice. And it's really about this idea of being able to leverage heterogeneity as a concept, which is about, you know, it's basically describing a system's characteristics sort of being diverse in nature, and that, you know, really supporting resilience against all sorts of impacts, both social and environmental. And the term is often used in the biological sciences. It was really interesting as, you know, I was dialing into this and going back to my education and remembering the botany classes I took. You know, this term is widely used in the landscape ecology movement, and, you know, it really led me to believe that, you know, we're often like talking about heterogeneity of ecological systems, but, you know, never, I just found myself asking, like, why aren't we also thinking about this from a social and human perspective as well? How do we sort of holistically approach heterogeneity to really leverage opportunities for human potential to be, you know, sort of exacerbated within the public realm? And what was really interesting about kind of dialing into this is that, you know, at the heart of it, it's about how we provide resilience for the long term. And one of the really interesting things about heterogeneity as a concept, right, is that as you think about both its configurational and compositional nature in terms of the system, the more heterogeneity you have within its structure, the more resilient it is to outside forces. So things like, you know, the pandemic that we've found ourselves in for the last 2 years, all the way to natural disasters and climate change. And what's fascinating about this, right, it's about this sort of embrace of difference. It's this embrace of this constantly evolving and sort of ever-changing dynamic system. And one of the really interesting things about this is how do we relay that to the human sciences, and how this relates, you know, in the American context to how our country is changing and how we as designers become better equipped to address the needs of the growing diverse populations that exist in the country. And I think one of the really fascinating things for me, you know, when looking at these maps, these were developed by ULI, is when we look at change, it's happening not just on the coast, it's happening all over the country. And one of the interesting stats that came out of this is that, you know, one of the largest trends is actually in individuals of multiple races and that identify, you know, across race lines. And I think that's also really interesting for us as landscape architects in terms of how we think of the public realm and how we can use, you know, systems and design paradigms like heterogeneity to be able to meet the needs of our ever-evolving society. So it led me to kind of putting together this like really simple diagram that's trying to kind of bring all of these pieces together. And in its simplest forms, it's about being able to say, yes, we understand, you know, the importance of the system and the ecological attributes to it, but we also need to marry that with the social sciences. We really need to understand the anthropology of how public spaces operate and really look at the cultural, social, and linguistic mechanisms that often manifest themselves facially to really, you know, come to a sort of landscape framework that's really centered around heterogeneity and this embrace of difference and bringing ecology into the mix. And, you know, what's really interesting about this, and, you know, I apologize for being fluffy, but it's important, is that, you know, I have my daughter and I always talk about space. She's very interested in space. And one of the most fascinating things, right, about dialing into heterogeneity as a concept is that it's what defines this planet, right? It's actually what allows us to thrive. The infinite heterogeneity that exists both in our fauna and flora, within our human systems, within our biological systems, all of this allows us to thrive on this planet and define us. And I think what's really interesting is how we as landscape architects can embrace that, to not just, you know, do it within, you know, diverse plant palettes, but also look at the types of public spaces and experiences we're creating for a really diverse plethora of individuals. And, you know, for me, just a little personal here, you know, a lot of this started in the Dominican Republic for me. I'm an immigrant to this country. I wasn't born in the United States. I grew up in the island of Hispaniola, like right in the middle of the island in the mountains. And, you know, I grew up in a village where there was like no running water or electricity. And, you know, we didn't have landscape architects, but this is still landscape architecture, you know, like that mango tree and the seating and the seat wall that's built into this public space was intentionally designed to create community and place. And as I, you know, immigrated to the United States and entered my landscape architectural education, I was always trying to find myself within this spectrum of, you know, understanding how community was built for me, which was, you know, very sort of grassroots and community centric, with the way in which landscape architecture is practiced in America and the importance of land. You know, my relationship to the environment was of sustenance. You know, I relied on it for food, for my livelihood when I was in the Dominican Republic. And, you know, all of those perspectives were really critical to the formation of the research I've been doing and the way in which I practice within SASAKI. And I think one of the things that's really important as, you know, we think about you all as future leaders within the profession is that this is about being able to embrace your lived experience. I have that very unique perspective from the Dominican Republic, but, you know, every time I go to a community meeting, there's a myriad of perspectives that we hear from individuals in terms of how they use public space, who designed it, how, you know, what their experiences are. And one of, you know, the critical things here is that it's really important for us as landscape architects to open ourselves up to those lived experiences as critical drivers for design, implementation, and for us to see ways in which, you know, we can create new landscape experiences based on how, you know, different people use it and have navigated it through their lives. So one of the things that's, you know, before I kind of share a couple of project examples that I wanted to sort of share with you all is that as I was doing my work around landscape heterogeneity, you know, it was focused on the United States. It was focused on practice in America. And it was really important to me to understand the underlying values of the profession and to dismantle, you know, what I was sort of deeming formula for homogeneous spaces. And a lot of this really starts with like understanding property and land and sort of debunking some myths. I often hear, you know, landscape architects talk about like, you know, public space is universal, it's welcoming for all. But the reality is that it's not. There are individuals that were themselves considered property and land themselves that didn't have access to sort of that wealth building. So when we talk about landscape architecture, it has always, and land particularly, it's always this dichotomy between you know, even, you know, Olmsted's understanding of what was nature, right? These were managed lands by indigenous individuals over many hundreds of years that, you know, quote unquote as nature, these were designed, managed landscapes by Indigenous communities that don't get credit for that. And to more modern day examples of this, where, we're looking at loitering practices in certain cities, right? And who's deemed acceptable to use space and for how long. And then, obviously what we've been seeing over the history of this country with much of the violence that's enacted in public spaces around Black and brown bodies. And, at the end of the day, what became so clear to me within this research is that land is not neutral. It's actually one of the most poignant expressions of power, especially here in America. And it's really important for us to understand that importance and how we can systematically dismantle that and provide new opportunities for different communities to not just see themselves in the space, but to know that the spaces are being designed with them in mind. And, I want to be clear that this isn't done with like malicious. I don't think people are out there trying to purposely do that. But there is a system and a formula that really feeds into this thinking. And, it starts with like institutions and structural systems. So, as a practitioner, we're chasing work in different places, and there's different criteria, right? You have to meet to chase the work. You need to have X, Y, and Z experience. And it really does preclude often individuals that have the most insight into their own communities from being able to be part of that process. To, the design process and education system itself, right? Just challenging what we're teaching our students and really opening our eyes to different understandings of how landscape architecture practice and the value systems emerge over time. So, everything from getting your hands on Craig L. Wilkins, the aesthetics of equity, and really kind of dialing into Lockean theory and understanding, what the foundation of landscape and land really mean in America is really important. To, the final product, after you go through design and create it and you're constructing it, there's sort of this need for perfection and this need for all of the details to come together perfectly. And at the end of the day, who are we designing perfection for and in service of who? And who are we excluding in that process? When we're putting in skate deterrence within certain public spaces, we're not creating places that are for all, we're creating places for the few and that exclude many oftentimes. So, this really kind of led me to like, okay, well, heavy stuff, what do we do about it? And I think this is where, all that work around landscape heterogeneity really came in and wanting to think like, okay, we have the social life of small urban spaces and some of the work from Design with Nature that's kind of grappling with these issues, but how do we more systematically map and understand these pieces of the anthropological systems of public spaces within our design process? And, oftentimes like a lot of this information is qualitative. It's, postcards or feelings that individuals have that are shared during open houses or community engagement sessions. And what we wanted to do was to start to visualize that, to start to map it, to look at what does it mean to, map where affirmative spaces are in a particular community? What does it mean for us to be able to like pinpoint where color, what colors feel like home, what sort of design elements evoke a sense of belonging for particular communities as a way in which to really define new modes of practice. And I think one of the things that's also been really exciting about this work is also being able to look at ways in which we can represent this. This is a collage here that we did for some of the work we were doing for the Frederick Douglass Project and in Boston. And one of the really interesting things here, right, is that these are affirmative spaces for Black Womex in this neighborhood. And what's really fascinating about this is that we can start to thread all of the different sort of architectural and urban design vernaculars that really define what feels welcoming, what feels like home to certain individuals, and what those markers are and how we can build upon that. And often some of these spaces aren't designed by landscape architects, they're community-led spaces, nonetheless important to the way in which we design. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and just share a couple of case studies, because I think a lot of this stuff feels fluffy when designing. I think one of the things that's really important to me is sort of being able to open myself up to new opportunities and remove my bias as much as possible and immerse myself in culture. And I've developed these sort of heterogeneous indicators as a means for really thinking about what the design process can do and how we can embark on processes of unlearning throughout design to really think about, what does it mean to create a pluralism within the landscape? What does it mean to think about empowerment and representation and healing? And I think these are all really important pieces that I bring forward into my work as I dive into practice. So the first project I wanted to share with you all is the Frederick Douglass work, as I mentioned earlier, within that collage. This was a project in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston, a historically Black neighborhood. What was really interesting is from the get-go when we got started, it became so clear how many years of disinvestment this community has seen, and the square that would be the place of this future plaza and sculpture had been dedicated to the dedicated as the Frederick Douglass Square in 1917. And here we were still trying to sort of enact that space. And one of the really fascinating things about getting into projects is that I think it's so important to not only, find maps, but also look at art, read books, really understand how these spaces were being used, and find inspiration in often unconventional places. This right here is an image of our site rendered by Alan Creed in 1936. Really showing, the vernacular of this place and the liveliness of this community and this area, which, Frederick Douglass himself had spoken in open air meetings. And, it doesn't take much for you to kind of see history kind of play itself out. Just across the street from our site is Slade's, which was, and still remains the oldest Black-owned business for food and nightlife in Boston. And just to the right of our site, we also have the Douglass Square Pharmacy, which was an Underground Railroad station that, is really important, right, to that journey from the south to the north. And then just across the street, the Boston Guardian, which was the first Black-owned newspaper. So one of the things I always say to, my colleagues is it takes digging deeper, it takes caring about doing the research to see it. And I think it's so important because these are pieces of history that are often forgotten as we think about new sites, and it's important for us to remember these communities and really work towards placekeeping in these places. And now one of the things that was really interesting for us after we did all that initial research was just thinking, okay, well, we really have to radically think differently about how we do community engagement, and particularly how we dive into design. And one of the things that was really interesting for us, and, to be honest, as a landscape architect really pushed me here, is how do we use this notion of heterogeneity to develop new methods of engagement? And this meant that, we basically didn't have a presentation. We weren't speaking to the community. We brought in a spoken word artist and had one of the most meaningful sessions in my career. And It was so intimate. It was really an opportunity for us to really get an understanding of not only what the concerns were in this community, but also what the aspirations are and what their vision and needs are for a place that is representing healing and evolution in the community. And it was really a powerful way of connecting to the community that I don't think would have come about had we not really embraced heterogeneity as part of our process. And this also meant that we needed to kind of also find inspiration in unconventional places. It meant that, you know, we were looking at our project site, obviously, and getting a sense of what was nearby and what were some of these beloved community spaces that really created a sense of place. And you can look at these images and certainly see disinvestment, but it became so clear during that workshop that this is where the community felt like they could belong. This is where Black men felt like they weren't going to be policed. And this was really representative of a lot of African diaspora symbols that were really important to this community moving forward. And these were all critical pieces for us to sort of pull from as we started to look at, you know, our site. It was really, you know, sort of unassuming in its nature, and really look at opportunities for developing a vision that really embraced a lot of what we were learning and a lot of the inspiration and cues we were getting from the neighborhood with murals commemorating Douglas's legacy as being critical to this place. And just a point of context as well, you know, this neighborhood is seeing a tremendous amount of gentrification. So there was real emphasis on placekeeping and how do we keep the history of this neighborhood in Roxbury alive, even if many of the residents that lived here no longer remain. And these images, again, are just some images from the Douglas Peace Garden that really served as great inspiration for us. Really looking at, you know, these planters, which, you know, again, unassuming. Certainly you can see disinvestment, but as we dug in deeper, it became so clear that the circles were actually representative symbols of African gardens and symbolized a warding off of evil spirits. That was really critical to this community. And these are pieces that I think it's so important for us to go into these sessions really listening and opening ourselves up to seeing beauty where I think we have been trained not to see beauty. And one of the things that was also really exciting about this work was, you know, our collaboration with the community and the local artists group there. It was really fascinating to see some of the work that Paul Goodnight and Mara Chudo had done in terms of, you know, how do you commemorate Douglas, you know, this, what are the symbols that are really important and how do you experience that artwork in the public realm? And you know, we really, when we started to put this together and get ideas, you know, it was a lot about like, okay, how do we create a collage that kind of gets at a sense of this dynamic space? How do we think about Juneteenth celebrations happening here? And really at the heart of it, how do we create a Black landscape? And what does that mean? What are those markers that are really important to that concept? And this meant that, you know, it wasn't just like this aspirational vision, but how do you tactically make that a reality? And this is one of the really exciting things that I think of as a landscape architect is that, you know, we have such agency in writing specifications and picking out materials. And I think there's limitless opportunities for us to look at cultural expression within these pieces. And for us, it was about, you know, how do we think about this carpet, which, you know, was sort of the platform which the sculpture sits in as being representative of the African diaspora and, you know, working with the community to identify what the symbolism of color, the symbolism of materials, like this golden aggregate, right, being sort of very symbolic to the community and the African diaspora. And also really thinking about, right, how do we think about the detailing of these things? How do we start to really inform culture in a really reflective way within the landscape itself? And what was really interesting about this, right, is that the cultural carpet was influenced by this journey from the south to the north, right, and how Douglas's legacy played into that. So, you know, we were looking at the means in which many African Americans navigated landscape to make their ascent to the north, using rivers and meandering corridors as key places for safety and for finding their way to freedom. And it really allowed for us to kind of build upon that, right, and kind of break it down. How do we layer all of these pieces together and really inform a site design that, again, at every step of the way, every single detail, we're embracing this notion of heterogeneity, and in this particular instance, really focused on Black excellence at the heart. And as I mentioned earlier, research is so important, and not just doing it in the beginning, but throughout the process. You know, as we were starting to get into planting design, it was really important for us to also look at what planting inspiration we could draw from and how we make that as authentic as possible. These images here are from an exhibit called Places of Spirit at the Smithsonian by Von Sills that really looks, she sort of went to the American South and photographed gardens. And what's so fascinating about this is it actually reminds me of home. It reminds me of the Dominican Republic and the usefulness and tactfulness, right, of unfound objects and the diversity of a plant palette, right, that's really informed by need and resourcefulness. And these were really important markers for us as we started to kind of dial into the planting inspiration and really look at, you know, things in the ecology movement that, you know, are now deemed ecology were often practices that had been done by Indigenous and Black and Brown people for a very long time as important drivers. And it also meant looking locally, you know, understanding what Freedom and Juneteenth gardens mean in Roxbury. And these are some images of some of those gardens and the folks working in them. And it was just so important to us to sort of work with Natalka, who you see here on the left, and really get a sense, right, of a landscape that is healing itself and healing those experiencing it at the same time. And that led us in unconventional ways in terms of developing our plant palette. And then also going back, right, to some of that initial sort of reconnaissance, like going out and looking at spaces that, you know, seemed abandoned, but actually provided such a source of inspiration for us. And it really meant that, you know, we were trying to sort of tie all of these pieces together to develop a plant palette that really connected to the diaspora. So the symbolism of the diaspora, the biodiversity, really looking at the medicinal qualities, right, that could be embedded into it. And also this sort of feeling of this oasis, this place unlike any other that could really provide an important threshold for us. And it meant that, you know, our plant palette really ranged. We were looking at all these different opportunities for us to really work with the community to develop this. So there was a sunflower project happening in Roxbury where Natalka and her team went out and planted sunflowers all over the neighborhood as a form of beautification. And a lot of them remember growing up and their grandmothers growing buttercups, which were these little flowers that like suction onto your nose or your chin. And you know, the saying was that you turned into butter. You got, you know, you became soft after you played with the buttercups. And, you know, all of these pieces are sort of a piece of memory and a piece of healing here that is really working together to tell this story of heritage. And to really look at, you know, how we evoke these senses throughout the seasons and the importance of, you know, both the local initiatives and also this sort of broader story that both symbolizes Douglas and also the evolution of this community. And it was also important for us to also look at the materiality, looking at, the stone, the steel we were using, and even looking at the typeface we were going to use for some of the engravements, always ensuring that we were sort of representing that Black aesthetic, and really liberating ourselves from these ideals of perfection, right? So going back to that concept of heterogeneity, right? Like, how do we really embrace difference? How do we really think about those ideas moving forward? And we drew a lot of inspiration graphically from the Black graphic design history, and sort of particularly in this neighborhood, just really working to understand how art was depicted, and how we can draw upon that within this space. And again, at every sort of step of the way, whether there's signage or anything like that, we're providing opportunities for that embrace of difference and identity. And it also came down to the symbolism itself. So, going back to Africa and really kind of dialing into some of these really unique symbols that actually mean quite a bit to the community, and how we can start to think about, hey, could we start to think about the slatting and the benches, right, taking on some of this symbology in a more intentional way. To sort of developing, our vision, which is really centered around bringing all of these pieces together, really thinking about how this space is a place of nourishment, of healing, and of, presenting a path forward that really embraces everything Douglas stood for and the resilience this community represents. And so that's, one little project that I wanted to share with you all that I think is really interesting. And really does embrace this notion of heterogeneity and is sort of at a site scale. The next piece I wanted to kind of share with you all is something a little bit more zoomed out, more at the planning level. And this is the work we did for the city of Boston with their heat resilience plan, and looking at how do we address extreme heat in the future. And one of the things that was like so fascinating as we started to dial into this was that, I approached my team and I was like, hey guys, my landscape heterogeneity work is so important to resilience work. And I really want to make sure that we embrace it in this process. And everybody was game, and it was a really fun way to kind of dial into this. And for us to also understand, I just want to preface, we're also working on the coastal resilience work as well for the city. And I'm on that project as well. So sort of balancing the two. And what was really surprising to me is how impactful heat is. So, as we look at all of these sort of natural disasters and building resilience against them, heat is the #1 contributor to deaths that are related to climate, more so than coastal storms, more than tornadoes, more than hurricanes, more than flooding. It is heat that really does impact many people in urban environments in really extreme ways. And, when we started the work with the city, it was really important for us to work with them to understand these risks and to see which neighborhoods were at further risk than others, and how this was actually interconnected with systems of environmental injustice and systemic racism, which I'll share a little bit more about in a bit. So, when we first started kind of doing our work, it was really important to kind of understand how people perceived heat risk. And a lot of it is like, well, it's hot, or, it's sort of weather related, and it's very personal. But when we zoom out a little bit, we start to sort of see that there's some other factors, right, that sort of determine your perception of heat, everything from your age all the way to your health. And a lot of these things, which we coined under sort of adaptive capacity, are whether you have access to cooling, right? So whether you're a blue collar or white collar worker, whether you have affordable cooling options available to you, whether, you know, transportation and sort of physical access are key. So again, you know, personal, but once you start zooming out, you start to see more systematically how this is sort of interconnected. And then you add the built environment to it, right? You look at, you know, how do the surrounding buildings in your neighborhood play into that? How does the amount of impervious surfaces and pavements really affect, right, your experience of heat? And also your proximity to parks and cooling, right? And we've done a ton of work on like equity atlases, looking at, you know, the actual, you know, looking at cities throughout the country and their proximity to open spaces. And as we know, there's quite a discrepancy across many cities in terms of, you know, access to public space. And then we would be remiss to sort of point out that, you know, some of this is also related to, you know, these systems of racism. And one of the key things that I'll share here is that, you know, as we look at sort of long-term impacts, there's redlining and disinvestment that really play into what neighborhoods are hotter than others. And you'll see that in some of the data we share. And now the thing that was like really crazy about a lot of these stats was that, you know, we were also looking at what does this mean for Boston in the future? And it's very cold here for a long time of the year. And what's really fascinating, right, is that by 2070, we're going to be seeing, you know, upwards of 25 to 90 days where we have temperatures above 100 degrees. So, you know, imagine like Boston summers being just as hot as like DC summers, which is, you know, unheard of for us here. So, you know, the way in which climate change is taking place in our world is really impacting heat and the vulnerability many communities have. And now, you know, one of the things that was really fun for us throughout this process was, you know, how do we engage experts that really do enrich our process and work? And one of the things that became very clear to us within this process was that we really needed to understand both daytime temperatures and also nighttime temperatures. So not only do we need to see like during the day, where are the hottest spots, but, you know, what happens at night? What about the neighborhoods that can't cool off? So you can see like Chinatown super hot during the day. So is the South End, so is Roxbury. And then, you know, at nighttime, you can see how Chinatown's actually even hotter than it was during the day, and how disruptive that actually is to the livelihoods and health of individuals in those communities. And I'm not going to get into like all the nerdy stuff around how we came up with our metrics, but I think it's really important to also highlight the rigor that goes into the data and science around resilience work, and how important it is for us as landscape architects to be embedded in those conversations. So we were working with Myring and their team in developing this Urban Heat Island Index and marrying it with our model. And particularly, how do we look at being able to take this like hard data and soften it a little bit with some of the experiences we were getting from our engagement with the community. And, you know, one of the things that was also really important for us in this was also understanding the duration of heat, right? So like when you think of your heat experience, it's not like today is hot, right? It's like the whole, you know, your continuum of heat throughout the day is what elevates your risk. And really looking at how we can position the work around these strategic neighborhoods that, you know, have, you know, over, you know, 37 hours of heat during heat waves, right? So where the neighborhoods are not cooling off at all, and there's actually no relief for the community. And again, this really does exacerbate, you know, health-related illnesses and also crime. There's heat and sort of domestic violence and policing are tied together. And I think it's really important to interconnect those pieces. And, you know, I would be remiss to say that, you know, a lot of this work, because we were really embracing heterogeneity, was about embracing difference and about us digging deeper. And, we were looking at our redlining maps of the city of Boston to understand how risk and these, this practice have led to some of the ways in which these neighborhoods have been invested in today. So what was really fascinating, right, is that the neighborhoods that were deemed hazardous, right, often neighborhoods that had Black and brown bodies, people in them, they couldn't get mortgages, et cetera, you can see are some of the hottest neighborhoods in the city, whereas neighborhoods that were deemed desirable, often white neighborhoods, are significantly cooler than their surrounding areas. And this is all due to, investments in infrastructure and resources going to these neighborhoods versus those deemed hazardous. And again, these are mortgage lending practices that sort of made their way into some of the urban planning practices of many cities. This also meant that, as we started to think about redlining and equity, that there was a real disparity here with tree coverage and access to parkland, and how much cooler some of these neighborhoods were in comparison to those that were deemed hazardous. So again, really important for us to really think of, there's like a 4-degree difference, right, between the neighborhood that's like deemed, that was deemed best with these redlining practices versus those that were deemed hazardous. And this really led us to kind of really getting into further detail within each of these neighborhoods and sort of assessing risk and looking at ways in which we can connect. And now one of the fun things that, as I mentioned earlier, our strategies team really came clutch when we were doing engagement. And, we started this work in the middle of the pandemic. And it was so difficult to have these conversations while also, being aware of the fact that we couldn't meet in person. And we came up with this idea of creating these comic heat stories. So like people could create their own comic exercises. You had the ability to create your own avatar. One really key piece here is you could customize it. Representation is so key here. So, really allowing individuals to, it's not like a basic avatar, but you can have a lot of fun creating them. And then, we were asking questions like, what neighborhood are you in? What's your experience of heat throughout the day? Where are you going? Why is it hot? They could pick their backgrounds. And in the background, we were kind of collecting all this data that was sort of specific to each of these neighborhoods and zip codes that then fed into some of the more, quantitative analysis that I just shared with you all. So again, another really neat way in which we can really leverage technology, and especially at SASAKI work with our strategies group to develop really cool pieces like this. And, it also meant that we had to get really smart about how we look at developing solutions. And we had these neighborhood idea sessions, and, we're using Miro and all of these different and iPads to sort of try to come up with different solutions and in real time sort of recreate, what it would mean to be together and sketch together, as a community. And, the thing that sort of came out of all of this is us looking at, heat resilient strategies that were really focused on, relief during heat waves. What does it mean to actually think systematically about cooler communities more comprehensively? And then also just the community health and healing piece. How do we, look at reparations for certain communities and think about ways in which to strengthen the economies of each of these neighborhoods so that they can benefit from some of this infrastructure. Some of the ideas that came about were things such as cool main streets, looking at places like Mattapan Square, where you can see, there's very limited shade, and really looking at opportunities for, both architectural solutions and landscape solutions that really provide benefits for cooling along these really key corridors. This is everything from, looking at shaded bus stops to, more creative ways of sort of activating the public realm and creating pocket parks that really allow for relief, as you're sort of moving about your day and navigating from point A to point B. One of the other things too that, it is key here, as well as also understanding health corridors. So that came up through our engagement sessions where, often many folks in these vulnerable communities were having to navigate really traverse and difficult sort of corridors to get to health services. So, if you suffer from high blood pressure and you have to walk miles, in a very hostile and hot environment, by the time you get to your appointment, you've got elevated blood pressure and et cetera. And again, just really looking at not just the Main Street component of it, but some of these health corridors as being really critical in how we provide shade and relief for individuals that are seeking medical services and may not have access to, to sort of transportation. Another piece of this too, and I think this was unique to this planning work, often when you're doing planning work, you're not like building anything. And one of the things here that was really fun about this heat resilience work was the ability for us to really kind of dial in on opportunities to create place and really build momentum for the work we were doing. And we built these sort of temporary cool spots that were really meant to provide relief for the community during COVID, and to also sort of show, we had, you kind of can't see it in this image. It's like all the way at the top, there's like these little Kessler data trackers. So we were kind of looking at, what the temperature difference is between a tree versus X porosity of shade structure versus, spaces that were exposed to, hot surfaces. So we were getting nerdy and also having fun and making, the planning tangible to the community in a way that was really effective for this particular piece. And we also worked with the City of Boston's Public Library to sort of provide Wi-Fi and all sorts of fun amenities for the community to sort of share and enjoy as they were engaging in these spaces. And it was one of those really fun pieces that I think really heartened our souls as we were kind of doing this work. And I think I'm running a little bit late on time, so I'm not going to go into the last project, but I will say that I think what's been really exciting about SASAKI is this broad range, and the ability to take some of the research I've been doing and really apply it in a very tactical way to the way in which we practice. As you can see here, everything from planning to like site scale, there's a real opportunity and agency we all have to embrace difference and to embrace heterogeneity as a landscape platform that can really lead to some unique solutions. And again, I think, make our world a little bit more exciting and diverse. So with that, I'll just stop and say thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana, for an amazing presentation, and thank you again for being here with us tonight. Now we're going to be moving on to the Q&A portion of this session. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat that we've going. So now without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and pass this on to Catherine, who is going to be leading the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Sorry that I currently cannot be seen right now. My camera is having technical difficulties, but hopefully that won't detract from anything. But Diana, our first question is, given the given the progressive change that our industry is experiencing and the greater recognition and awareness of our work, what do you imagine the future of landscape architecture to look like?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think one of the things that's really fascinating about this time is that, you know, there's like, just as an example, here in Boston, we elected a new mayor, Mayor Wu, who's really focused on the Green New Deal as a platform for environmental and social change. And it's been really fascinating, right, to see how we as landscape architects sort of interject ourselves into that conversation. And where that's going. And I think it's really fascinating because I think we are kind of like nimble in the fact that we're always sort of in between, like we're the conveners of information. And I think it's an exciting time for us to be leading a lot of this work and to be presenting new methods. And I couldn't be happier to be a landscape architect. You know, I think it's just, there's an incredible amount of knowledge and sort of wealth of resources available out there that are really pushing the boundaries of what we could do. Everything from, you know, a lot of that technical nerdy stuff I was sharing with you guys related to heat resilience and how deep we were getting into that data versus, you know, things that may be a little bit more symbolic, a little bit more spiritual, like the work we did for the Frederick Douglass Memorial. So, you know, at the end of the day, I think there's just an incredible opportunity for us to sort of really sort of insert ourselves into a lot of the conversations that are happening nationally within our country around society, around placemaking, and especially around the environment and how we sort of live a more sustainable future moving forward.
Cool, thank you. That's really interesting. So our next question is, how has your design process changed over the course of your career, and what have you learned from that experience?
I'm sorry, Catherine, can you repeat that again? You kind of broke up a little bit for me.
Oh, sorry, I apologize. So how has your design process changed over the course of your career, and what have you learned from that experience?
That's a great question. I think for me, when I first entered the profession, it started in school. And I remember it was really interesting because, you know, I'm obviously from the Caribbean and I love color and expression. And I remember I did one of my plans in like red and orange. I rendered my trees in red and orange. And my professor was like, that's not what you do. Like, greens and taupes, and you know, that's landscape architecture. And you know, I spent a lot of my early career trying to assimilate, trying to sort of fit into a profession that it wasn't like intentionally excluding me, but it certainly didn't feel like what I grew up seeing. It didn't feel of place. So, you know, I spent a lot of time just trying to fit in. And as I continued to navigate my career, and the more and more I got exposure to sort of the communities I was working with, it became so clear to me that it was so important to just embrace where I come from, to embrace what I represent, the experiences, my lived experiences as part of the way in which I practice. And honestly, when I stepped into those shoes, was when I became the most valuable to my teams, when I became the most valuable to the communities I was serving, because I was really approaching it in a very authentic way. And it just, you know, it was really exciting for me, I think, to find myself now with 10 years of experience and really getting into the meat of the work and implementing it and building landscapes that really do reflect that. So if, you know, there's one thing I can share with all of you young people, is just like really trust your intuition and trust your gut on who you are and what you want to build in the practice. I think the profession of landscape architecture is so vast and diverse that I think there is room for all of us. to develop new modes of practice and for that to be okay. And that's one of the things that it really excites me, is that evolution and that growth into kind of really embracing my lived experience as a point of departure.
Wow. Your story really, I think, resonates with, and experiences have really resonated with a lot of students that are probably on this call right now. So thank you for that insight. Our next question is, how has your background growing up in the Dominican Republic directly influenced your design or choices of design projects?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I attribute both like growing up in the Dominican Republic and then immigrating to New York City as kind of like really formative for me. So I went from like rural village with no running water and electricity to like concrete jungle, and like we lived across the street from the train and in a really underinvested neighborhood. So, you know, it really did sort of portray community in a different way for me. Like, you know, I didn't know we were poor or that we lived in a bad neighborhood until I got to college and got to see other, you know, other people's experiences. Like, I thought it was normal for everyone to know there's like homeless guy in the corner who you just knew, you know? So like, it was really interesting for me to sort of unpack that a little bit, you know, as I got to college and got to experience more of the country and what other experiences existed. And I just always had an affinity for, you know, sort of this quest of, you know, finding places that really did represent, you know, my culture, places that maybe weren't designed by landscape architects, were kind of in between places and cities, as really being representative of the aesthetic and the work that I was really interested in. So there was just something so interesting about that. And, you know, as I dug deeper, I don't know if you all are familiar with David Governor's work at UPenn, but, you know, even in studying that, you know, informal settlements and knowing that most of our world is actually, most of the people in the world live in informal settlements, right, that are kind of organically formed, was really fascinating to me. There's like incredible wealth of research around principles of heterogeneity that really do define these places and their evolution. And it's just been really exciting to kind of dive into that and with a little bit more rigor, and to sort of see how, you know, my experience kind of growing up there really did shape, I guess, what I gravitated towards. Although I did spend a lot of time kind of, like I said, assimilating. I then found my way. And I will say, like, you know, his work is really fascinating. And I also highly suggest reading Craig L. Wilkins' work, The Aesthetics of Equity. I think it's a really fantastic piece of literature. It's focused on architecture and hip hop, but there's a lot on public space.
Okay, cool. We have a quick like follow-up question for that. What was the book that you were talking about? I believe by David Governor.
He's written like a bunch of books, but a lot of his work is around informal settlements, many in South America. If you look him up and look up like David Governor Penn, you'll see all of the literature. He's a prolific writer, and I think also very interesting individual. So highly suggest, you know, watching one of his lectures. Very passionate, and so much research around informal settlements. And when you think about most of the world living in an informal settlement, it's, you know, it does beg the question, right? Like, how are we thinking about the developing world in the future? You know, what does that look like? Are there pieces to learn from, right, in the way in which human society has evolved over time, and how we create place within these different constraints?
Great, thank you. And just to clarify, that Penn is Penn State, correct?
Oh, I'm sorry, the University of Pennsylvania. Thank you
Okay.
for clarifying that.
Thank you. Just wanted to make sure. Our next question is what would your advice be to students entering this career? And what is the most vital skill to be successful in this field?
Persistence. It's it's hard. We work long hours. It's a profession that I think no one really knows about. And I'm always like struggling with like, oh man, like we're not just the folks that put the bushes around the buildings. Like we place buildings too. So I think it's been really fascinating to kind of dive a little bit deeper into what it means for landscape architecture, like moving forward. And I think, as a student, I think a piece of advice I would give you is you don't need to, I remember being in your shoes and feeling like, oh my God, I needed to be good at everything. When I was in school, I needed to be a great renderer, great at grading and engineering and, great form giver. And I think, at the end of the day, you need to be competent in all of those pieces. But I think really kind of finding your voice and finding your passion. And there's some folks that just love construction and detailing more than, the folks that love more of the planning and design iterative work. So I think just know that like I've worked both at small and large firms, and I think you find your place and you need to know how to do all those pieces, but you don't need to be the best at all of it. You don't need to be this like, superstar all the way around. And I think finding your voice and finding how you can contribute to teams and collaborate, I think is really important. And then I would also say like, it's also really important to know that so much of our work is not just like us in a little bubble. We work often with engineers and structural engineers and architects and urban designers. So our work is so fluid and constantly engaging with all these different disciplines. So there's just an incredible amount of learning to be done there. And I highly suggest if you have opportunities to take interdisciplinary studios to do so, because you're going to find most of your career is, coordinating with engineers and coordinating with different disciplines. So, it's just, I think, kind of exciting for you all as students to kind of have the opportunity to see that the profession is really broad and that there's a lot of room for you all to grow. And as long as you remain passionate, I think it's like limitless. And I think that can be hard in the beginning, especially when you're working at you're learning basically. One of the things another piece of advice I'll share is, remain involved, your national ASLA or local ASLA chapters, because, even if your day-to-day work isn't like the most glamorous thing, it does give you a window into like influencing the profession at large. And I found that to be so important for me, is like keeping myself both grounded, and then also visionary, like kind of navigating those two scales.
Awesome, thank you. That one really resonated with me, especially just because I know that personally I've struggled with like the same thing that you have with like, do I have to be good at everything? So I think a lot of other students here are also hopefully got some good advice from you from that. Sorry, I'm looking at a question here. So a follow-up question is, what are the typical interdisciplinary experiences in your office?
It's really funny because I like to talk about SASAKI like well, maybe this is not the right analogy, but like honestly, it's different every time. And I think that could be maddening to some people, because you're like, what do you mean? Like, do you have new rendering graphic styles every time? I'm like, Sort of, yeah. Like it depends on the team. Like I think for us, like the interdisciplinary nature of our practice means that, for, the Frederick Douglass work, we had a graphic designer, civil engineer, urban designer, and landscape architect all working together in one team. And, we developed our own graphic style for representation that really sort of evolved out of the research and the intention setting we were doing versus, the heat resilience work where, we had this sort of plethora of data scientists, analysts internally, computer programmers, planners, all at the table kind of designing together with landscape architects. So it really is different every single time, and it leads to like very different sort of outputs in terms of like what we create. And I think when you look at our website, it's like you can kind of see that sort of diversity kind of play itself out across the different project types and who's leading what, and I think that's what makes it really exciting for me at SASAKI. It's just that, it's different every time, and being challenged or pulled and pushed in a different way, or, meeting a new colleague I haven't collaborated with before. And it just really makes our work so much better, right? To just have folks at the table and, the civil engineers putting on their landscape architecture hat and helping us think through solutions. So I think it's just like this iterative nature, and we're all kind of coming to it with like open eyes and open minds in terms of how we approach the work.
Awesome, thank you. That's awesome. We're gonna have our last question here, and it is: given your own history and professional experience, what does land mean to you?
I think, it's, as I mentioned in the presentation, I think for me, it's an expression of power always. I think as I got further and further into my research, it just became so clear that so much of the work that we do is sort of playing around with power dynamics in some way, right? So like even, for example, the coastal resilience work and the heat resilience work we were doing, right? There's a power dynamic related to the land, right? And who had control, who was an agency, who is not, right? And I think it's so important for us to understand that and understand the importance of being able to advocate for those communities, right? And like our ethical obligation to fight for that, sort of justice in the same way that we fight for like environmental pieces, I remember when I was in school, we invited Carol Franklin from Andropogon to speak at our school for a similar event like this. And one of the things that was so fascinating is that she was telling us like she would do all sorts of crazy things to get her, meadows built, back in the 70s and 80s when clients didn't really want to do that. Now it's more like, common practice, but back then it wasn't. And she sort of had this sort of guerrilla way of getting the work done that, always stuck with me. And I feel like that's what I carry forward with the work I do is I feel kind of guerrilla-like a bit when it comes to the community piece and how we really advocate for those pieces of culture, language, and social interactions in the way in which we design landscapes. So I'm always looking for that lens, and it's always there. I think, land, power, justice, all of that is interconnected, and we hold tremendous power as landscape architects. And I think with that power comes a lot of responsibility and agency for ensuring that it's distributed equitably.
Wow, another powerful, very powerful response. We had one last question here come in, so we'll have one more and this will be it. So our last question is, what diversity do you see happening in the future of our profession, as well as just the future in general?
Oh my gosh, guys, there's so many good practitioners coming up right now that you need to check out. So I'm a huge fangirl of Sarah Zweedy. Highly recommend checking her work out. She worked for GGN. She's an MIT and GSD grad, and just she was such a source of inspiration for me, as I was kind of landing closer to my work around heterogeneous futures. And she's building a practice. She's based out of Harlem, New York now, that I think is really pushing the profession of landscape architecture in a really positive way. And I'm so excited about all of these diverse practitioners coming up that are sort of looking at practice in a new way. And I think a lot of it is really happening in not only within the professional landscape architecture, but also like urban design. So I would say, checking out Justin Garrett Moore. He's also another really incredible urban planner, doing some just fascinating work around Black spaces across the country, and educating design professionals around these ideals. So I guess I'm just excited about where we're going, and I'm excited about you all coming up through the ranks and being able to see practitioners like this share their work in really authentic ways, and for you to be inspired to go out and do the same thing. I just think we're at this incredible nexus and moment in our profession where you can really kind of see the tables turning a bit and see new modes of practice, like Walter Hood and others that have just been doing this for a long time, but seeing some new perspectives sort of coming up.
Awesome, thank you. Well, that wraps up our Q&A, and I will now hand it off to Chandler Williams, our co-president.
Diana, thank you so much for being with us this evening. The research and the presentation that you delved into, it really shows how healthy our profession is. And it shows that the kind of direction it's going in, that the research that you're doing shows that landscape architects are more than, like you said, placing shrubs out in the yard, and it's really solving those larger issues. The infrastructure bill and things of that nature, things that are going to become very important, climate resilience. It just shows that we can actually solve those issues, and it's people like you that are inspiring this group of students. I can see all my other SCASL members in front of me here. They loved your presentation, and we're super excited about the work that you presented. So thank you again so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Diana.
Thank you for having me. This was so fun. And again, I think it's like, I hope you all take this and like turn it into your own thing, like what's your lived experience and how are you going to translate that into practice?
Well, thank you so much for being our first speaker of our LA Days series. And I invite everybody else to also come next Wednesday for Pamela Conrad from CMG Landscape Architecture in San Francisco. So thank you, Diana. Have a wonderful night. Thank you. Sorry, it is getting late on your end. But thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks.